Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast live stream Q&A section. I realize I've left my hat in the background. It was drying from yesterday's kayak. All right, yes. Oh, and there's a cat next to it. Well, that's wonderful. All right, so we're going to answer your Super Chat questions, starting with ones from the previous hour, and at some point in the middle, we will migrate to questions from this hour.
Actually, we're going to start, as we have been, with a few from episode 40, starting with just a couple of comments that I found particularly nice, and then a couple of questions, and then we'll go to those from the last hour. Greetings from Denmark. You guys provide a litmus test for the information we get. Ever since we got 24/7 news and after 9/11, we have slowly been divided to a point where even a family dinner feels like walking a minefield. So thank you for that. And the second comment is, your Discord is my new social media. Just voting with my dollar here. Call it a paid review by me, worth the buy-in.
Awesome.
Thank you for that as well. This is one of two questions then that I will that we will address from episode 40 that we didn't get to last time. In what way are you progressive? You guys seem very liberal. What are some progressive policies you want? What is your ideal progressive leadership?
Well, that's a tough one. I have to say, as much as people swear that the distinctions between leftist, liberal, progressive are clear, I've never understood them as somebody who's been on the left all my life. I certainly remember a point where the term liberal had been stigmatized so badly that I started referring to myself as a progressive just simply to not have the conversation bogged down immediately. So at least at that point, I think the distinction was an aesthetic one at best. I would say the thing that causes me to say that I'm a progressive is that I believe we have to change. We have to make a kind of progress in order to survive. That our system is on a fatal trajectory short term, that it contains many of the right elements, but that we have to introduce some new structure, and that basically the founders didn't know about, for example, evolution, and so they didn't build a system that was robust to the evolution of, let's say, mechanisms of capture. So I would just say I derive the meaning of the word progressive from the fact that we need progress. I believe that progress is essential, but I don't believe almost any of the things that many who would call themselves progressive claim to want or say that we need. So I believe we have to make progress, but that's about as far as that allegiance goes. I wouldn't be surprised to find others in that movement who had a similar feeling, but in general, what the progressives claim to want is dangerous.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that many have noted that we often talk in terms that sound like putting a lot of weight on individual responsibility and personal responsibility and such, and we do, but that is not contradicted by also seeing a need for collective action for those problems and issues in society that will be gamed by individuals if you don't have a mechanism by which you can prevent them being gamed. And so systems like healthcare, we can do better than what we currently have in the United States, in which you have insurance companies vying for the dollars of people without actually seeing any increase in the quality of the healthcare we're getting.
I would just add to these two things already on the table that in general, I find that liberals are more likely to see inequality in the current system that is worthy of and demanding of a solution. And I do believe our system has many biases in it that are worthy of a solution. Conservatives tend to see the system as more functional. And ultimately, as you've probably heard us say, or me at least, the aim of a liberal, the aim of a progressive ought to be to create a society that is so functional that one would be a fool to attempt to change it to make it better. In other words, perfection is impossible. A system that works really, really well is something that you should leave functional. And I don't believe we're there yet. I believe we have a long way to go. But
the goal of everyone should be to create a society that is so good that they now want to conserve it. Thus, the goal of everyone should be to be able to turn everyone into conservatives, not for a past that already exists, but for a future that we would like to create and then can try to conserve. And I think, as has been noted across many domains now, part of what is going on with this movement, not so much what we see on the streets, although I think there is some element of that as well, but for instance, in campuses and in corporations where you have the creation of whole swaths, whole divisions devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. These diversity, equity, and inclusion officers are creating a world, have themselves created a world that then requires that they never actually do the job that they're pretending, that they're claiming to be trying to do, because if they did so, they would put themselves out of work. And so, what we should all be doing is, those of us who, have jobs that are specific, activists and, DIE officers and such, should, if they are in any way being honest about their stated goals and aims, they should be trying to put themselves out of the particular kind of work that they are currently doing.
So I think this also, now that I think about it, creates a taxonomy of conservatives that I think I had not formalized yet. Mm-hmm. That there are three reasons, in light of what we've just said about progressives and liberals, there are three reasons that you might find yourself on the conservative side. One of them is that you believe that the system is in a place where change is likely to be more harmful than it is desirable.
Yeah.
The second...
You are not inherently opposed to the idea of change. You just don't think it's necessary.
Right. And so that's what we should all be shooting for, is that state. The second is that you might be insensitive to problems that might be solved in the system. In other words, you might regard it as fairer than it is because maybe you're not in one of the categories to which it is routinely unfair or something like that. Mm-hmm. And the third are people for whom the system is biased, who might like to conserve those biases. And so I sometimes think that liberals, when they talk about what they see wrong with conservatives, imagine that it's all that last category, right? And it isn't, right? I run into all three of these types. And so anyway, probably worth keeping in mind.
That's really good.
Three types of conservatives. And, one of those types is a type that even honorable liberals should be aspiring to join.
That's right. Good. What is the evolutionary explanation of drug addiction? Why are there withdrawals for something that slowly kills you? Love you, thanks, and unity for the win.
All right, unity for the win. Yeah. You want me to start?
Sure, yeah.
So first of all, I should say that there's an old model of addiction, which I'm convinced has some truth in it, but has been replaced by a new and better model of addiction. So the old model of addiction was based on heroin primarily, highly addictive drug that mimics the molecular structure of endorphins. And the idea is that your body produces these molecules to keep you, for example, from being overwhelmed by sensation, by pain in particular. So you have all of these systems across your body that are detecting damage and pain, and you are undersensitive to them. So you are not, for example, constantly paying attention to what's going on your arms and all of this. So you can pay attention to what you need to focus on. So these molecules that we make that limit sensation are something you can trigger artificially with a plant-made molecule, a molecule that the plant makes in order to keep herbivores from eating it. And the thing is, your body is monitoring how many of these molecules you need. So to the extent that you are supplementing those molecules, your body starts making less and less of them. So if you overwhelm your system with these molecules, maybe you get a pleasant sensation of numbness or whatever it is. But you're also sending a message into the system that causes a reduced production of your endogenous molecules. And at the point that you try to remove the supplement, you don't have enough of these things, and you're suddenly overwhelmed by the sensations that you were blocking out, and it takes time, right? The withdrawal period, it takes time to go back to producing normal levels of these things. So kicking the habit involves basically a kind of dysfunction. And so the idea was, it's hard to get off heroin because it's very painful as a result of this imbalance, and that keeps people who do heroin doing more heroin. The new model of addiction suggests, and there's a great deal of truth in this too, that creatures, all of us, tend to make these bad choices about ingesting these molecules when we don't have things that are rewarding available to us, right? And so, a rat in a boring cage may press the cocaine lever again and again, but a rat that has entertaining things to do is much less likely to get addicted to whatever substance is on offer. And so you will also recognize that this mirrors what you see in the world, that people with bad options often do get addicted to drugs. And this goes to one of my philosophical principles, which is you shouldn't hold people responsible for bad decisions when they only had bad decisions available to them.
Right. And it's easy to conflate cause and effect, and it's also quite possible that you have sort of an exacerbating effect where someone with bad options was more likely to become addicted, and of course, becoming addicted, it reduces their options further, which causes them to be even more prone to addiction, perhaps of a greater extent, or of more substances, etc.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I would say a number of things. I'm going to try to make sure we answer the exact question we were asked. I think that there's a lot.
There's a lot in there.
There's a lot in what we've said that's relevant to the question. But, so basically you have a physical system that you're disrupting in some sort of pleasurable way, and the removal of it leaves a disrupted system, which is not functional. Good options defeat bad options, which suggests, A, that, the thing that makes me angriest about what I was told about drugs when I was young is that drugs was even a category. Because drugs isn't a category, right? Drugs are many different substances, some of which you may, if you're trying to cope with certain things, these may be absolutely the most powerful tool in the arsenal, right? In the case of things like psilocybin, right? It's a very powerful tool. I would say none of these should be treated recreationally, though you should potentially have fun in the context of many of them. But
just, you mentioned psilocybin, and that and other hallucinogens / entheogens / psychedelics, all of these words mean slightly different but largely overlapping things, are interesting in that almost none of them actually have physically addicting characteristics, right? That you actually don't, there are no people who are physically addicted or would experience withdrawal from not taking mushrooms anymore. They might well miss them if
they might,
and especially if it's someone who is microdosing regularly and it's helping alleviate anxiety, for instance, they might see a decline in mental health as a result. But in terms of physical addiction, the model that you laid out, Bret, for what happens with heroin it's just not the same thing. And so this is exactly why we object to this idea that drugs is a category that makes much sense. You at least have to include caffeine and nicotine in the drug category, and frankly, caffeine and nicotine are a much better match for the model that includes heroin than are any of the entheogens or hallucinogens.
Yeah. So I guess I would just say finally that basically all of this argues that there's some sort of matrix of characteristics that you ought to be thinking of before you decide to engage one of these substances. And, in the case of heroin, probably just too freaking dangerous to be worth toying with it at all. On the other hand, that molecule taken in another way might be something that is manageable, right? What you don't want to get into is a situation in which the solution to the degradation of the function of the molecule is more of the molecule. Right. You get into a positive feedback situation where in order to deal with the loss of effectiveness of the molecule, you become addicted to greater and greater amounts of it or something like that.
Yeah. And I think that is an answer to the question about withdrawal, right? Like you don't expect withdrawal for something like mushrooms, but anything to which your body has become accustomed and as therefore either downregulated production of the thing in question, in the case of heroin and the similar opiates opioids that the body itself produces, or is otherwise accommodating. I don't actually have a good model in my head. I was going to say your body is otherwise accommodating for the intake, and therefore if you start reducing it, your body's going to go out of whack. But like with alcohol, I do not have a good model for what like alcohol withdrawal and such is about. I haven't seen it. I don't know any close stories, and I don't have a good model of what that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say something general, and it's possible that somebody else knows the specifics, but the body is capable of applying some kind of resource. So to the extent that alcohol disrupts your ability to accomplish something, maybe, it numbs your senses, some part of you can ratchet up heightened sensitivity, right? It doesn't negate the effect, but it may compensate for the effect to an extent.
Yeah, so, I think it's going to be compensatory somehow.
Yeah, it's going to be compensatory in some way. And it also, no doubt there are just simply costs to producing the detoxifying equipment. And so anyway, it may be that withdrawal has to do with the fact that if you drink a lot very regularly and then suddenly you're not drinking, but you're ratcheted up and you've got all of these molecules that have no job, that may be costly too in some way.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Do you think holidays have an evolutionary component to them? About every culture has them. Do you think a holiday like Halloween might act as a way to teach our children to control their fear when they see something scary? So that's really two different questions, and certainly they have an evolutionary component. And if we take it a little bit larger than holiday and make it, an annually or otherwise reliably repeating celebration of some sort, it acts as a calendar. It can act as a reset. It can act as often an actual reset. Like this is the moment before which we will forgive our debts, we will forgive our insults, and we will move forward. We
apologize for the things that we've done wrong over the past year.
Exactly. Sort of we will speak to our ancestors and tell them what has happened. And going forward, we know that anything that happens, we're going to have to tell our ancestors about that next year again. These are all things that are present in celebratory, reliable holidays across many cultures, and almost all of our modern ones in the weird countries, in the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, have lost so much of their context that they've become mostly about markets and buying shit, rather than Thanksgiving, which obviously has its root in some not so terrific original, sort of founding myths of America, however, remains one of the holidays that is least touched by the market. Other than turkey farmers, there's not a lot of people who explicitly benefit and profit from the holiday, and it really tends to be a time when at least some form of friends or family come together and share good food and break bread together, and hopefully to some degree discuss some of the things that they are in fact thankful for.
So go ahead.
No, go for it.
So you and I for years have been tinkering with holidays, feeling that many of them maybe not up to date, and we have in particular modified both Hanukkah and Christmas to modernize them or to update them in some way. I'm wondering if actually, now that you mention it, Thanksgiving doesn't need to be modified too. I've been hesitant about Thanksgiving because since it is effectively the only important holiday that hasn't been
captured by the market,
by market forces, it seems like don't touch it. On the other hand, I'm wondering if it doesn't fit a little bit with the question of unity and why it's breaking down. Right. In other words, there is some aspect of Thanksgiving which is about breaking bread with somebody on the other side of something.
Yeah.
And if it could not be made into a healing holiday, if in effect, I would say sitting down with people across some unbridgeable divide and breaking bread with them is inherently positive, and it is inherently American.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. That's wonderful. To the second part of the question about Halloween, I I've been thinking a lot about Halloween, actually, which is never, it was never a holiday that I was particularly into. I just, cosplay wasn't my thing. And so much of what is happening on the streets is that, right? It's cosplay. And unfortunately, a lot of what's happening in some of the fringe elements of, for instance, trans activism is actually cosplay as well. And, we're not allowed to say that, but that doesn't make it any less true. And I think, Halloween is pretty ridiculous in its American form, but, much beloved. And, we encouraged our children as long as they wanted to do it. Although our elder son, Zach, resisted the market part of it from a very early age. And we can tell some stories about that at a different time, perhaps. But I do think that we are missing, we have in some parts of the United States anyway, there's some celebration of Mardi Gras, which is, again, just this bastardization of Carnival. And, Carnival is depending on where you are in Latin America, originating from, a combination of the sort of, animist spiritual traditions of the original people with the Catholicism that came in with the Spaniards and the Portuguese. And you have for a few days before Lent is to start, before you have to give up something and basically live your best and most pure life for a lot of time, for 40 days, I guess. You get to just party, right? And so that's the way that Americans understand. You party and you drink, and well, that's a ridiculous bastardization. And I've been lucky and unlucky enough to be present for several carnivals in Panama and in Ecuador on, I guess, 3 different occasions. And some of them have been ridiculous, and some of them have been amazing. And what you see when it works is exactly what Carnival, and actually before the first time before I knew I was going to be, in all of these cases, it was with study abroad classes. So I was there with my students. And before I went down, and, I hadn't planned for us to be there for Carnival. You just find that when you're traveling for weeks and you happen to be there during Carnival, everything shuts down and there's nothing else you can do. So I thought, okay, we'll make it a learning moment. We'll make it a learning few days. We're going to, go in effectively as participant observers, as ethnographers, and see what we can learn and, yes, participate. And so I went back to my professor at UC Santa Cruz, who had taught my Brazilian society and culture class when I had been an undergrad, and who had taught me what I knew about Carnival, which was entirely at that point an abstraction, and who himself worked on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, near the exit of the Amazon, near Belém. And one of the things that he said that was most impactful to me, which I then shared with my students before we went and experienced this thing firsthand, was that it's an exploration of liminality. It's an exploration of borders, and which borders are there, and you can touch them and you can push them and they deform a little bit, but they're always going to bounce back, and which ones actually can be reversed, and which ones can be reversed for a day, and you can experience life as the other, and then you're definitely going to go back. And so the 3 examples that I remember he gave were male-female, and parent-child, and employer-employee. And I'm sure that last one had sort of slave and owner manifestations in the past, but that's not what is going on now. And just being able to switch your position, choose one of those or some other dichotomy, or not. It could be something with more roles than 2, and try on a different mantle for a day, for a few days, and know that at the end of it, unless you are grotesque, unless you do something truly awful, you're allowed to explore space that you wouldn't otherwise explore, and then you get to go back to your life and think on it and learn from it and have a better sense of what the other people in your life are also living like.
All right, 2 things to add to that. One of them I have some trepidation about, but we'll go there anyway. But I wanted to just say that the time we were together in Ecuador for Carnival,
in Cuenca in 2016.
In Cuenca in 2016, 30 of our students, and we were
and
in
our 2
Cuenca
children.
For 14 days.
Yeah, that was the longest place we were in our 11-week trip through Ecuador. We were in Cuenca for 14 days.
So this was a place where the students were all living in their own
homestays.
And they knew the town. They'd been walking around it. And so Carnival happened, and, we would intersect with them walking through the square or anything, but we weren't all together as a group in the same way.
34-person mob going through Carnival.
Right. So anyway, it was very interesting. Some of them got themselves into some trouble, and, all sorts of stuff happened, but we were able to observe and participate. So in Cuenca and in Ecuador more generally, one of the things that goes on during Carnival is that people buy this bottled foam and they shoot it at each other. So, boys might shoot it at girls that they are fond of or whatever, but people are spraying other people. Mm-hmm. We got sprayed for being gringos, and mm-hmm. that was just all in keeping with it. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I remember being struck by was that there was a police band.
Oh, and you took a beautiful picture of
Yeah,
this.
I got a nice picture. Yeah. If I'd known we were going to talk about this, I would have found it. But anyway, a little girl on her dad's shoulders looking at a police brass band marching down and being covered in foam. People are just attacking the police with this foam. And I was thinking at the time that actually this was a really healthy phenomenon. The band, the police were not freaking out. They were continuing to play. It was all something, by stepping out of
one guy's trombone maybe it was like filled with foam even.
Yeah. So anyway, imagine how healthy it is to have that relation. That is the opposite relationship
with the police.
Of all cops are bastards, right? All cops are bastards, to interact with them in any human way is unacceptable versus, oh, you know what? There's one day a year where I'm going to shoot that cop that has been giving me trouble or whatever.
I'm going to shoot him with foam.
With foam, mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing also involves a cop. The DHS officer that I mentioned on the stream and have taken so much crap for talking to.
Mm-hmm. How dare you?
Yeah, how dare I talk to a cop? But anyway, among the many interesting things he told me is about the training that he and his fellow DHS officers had gone through in order to deal with riots and protests and the like. And it involved all kinds of things like enduring tear gassing. They were themselves tear gassed. He did it on multiple occasions. And there was also some sort of thing where they traded off basically playing at being protesters and all of these things. And he describes basically these war games between DHS officers playing the DHS role and DHS officers playing the protesters role. And
the goal is not how better to harm the other.
Right.
The goal is how to be a better DHS officer, how to be a better policeman. And those better policeman, better DHS officer does not mean how can I hurt other people the most.
No, in fact, the thing that struck me the most was that actually he saw his role as protective, that the thing that he feared was that he was being boxed into a situation by protesters in which violence would be the only way to protect the buildings in question, and he didn't want people to get hurt. But his point was, we're not going to allow them to take the buildings. We can't. So anyway, there was that, but also, he described his own, how much fun it was to be on the other side of this line. And, he basically, it was clear that he was into it and he understood something about, and that's not to say that what is motivating these protesters is entirely about fun, but there is some aspect of it in which they do clearly enjoy their role. And it was interesting to hear, I hear one side demonizing the other. Yeah. I did not hear him demonizing the protesters, as troubling as it was to have them launching ball bearings with slingshots and things like that.
Right. Okay. Next question. Is there an evolutionary explanation for how something like placebo would come into existence? Is it maybe a side effect of some other feature that was naturally selected?
Oh, you're going to hate this answer. I apologize for it in advance. But that placebo effect that you think exists, it doesn't. There is a placebo effect, but it works like this. If you have a condition in which the manifestation of the condition is subjective, like I feel pain or I feel anxiety, then placebos will actually address it and you will feel less anxiety or less pain. But this does not manifest itself in things like longevity. If you have a condition that reduces your longevity and you take a placebo, there is no evidence that supports the idea that you will live longer or that you will, basically anything that's objective rather than subjective does not respond to this. And so you are absolutely correct in asking this question, that if placebo existed in the form that people think it exists, that would be an evolutionary paradox of major proportions, because why is it, if you have the capacity to heal, that you don't just simply heal? If somebody, by lying to you about some treatment they've given you, could trigger an endogenous system for healing, then the endogenous system should trigger itself. So anyway, I am already anticipating a great deal of hate mail that I will get over this one. I will be told that the placebo effect does exist and that I will be pointed to 1,000 things that will not reflect that. And I appreciate all of them, let me tell you. I don't know. I suppose that's where it lands. So from the point of view of, can you feel better by being told you've been given some treatment that, yes, you can if it's subjective. And I think the interpretation for why that would be is somewhat obvious, right? In other words, how focused on something subjective like pain should you be is a question of what situation you're in, right? If you're at home and you've damaged your limb and you need not to pick stuff up, maybe you need to be focused on that pain. If you're still on a battlefield, maybe you need to ignore that pain so you can survive to get home and focus on the pain. And so we have systems that are modulatable for this reason, that are subjective, and the ability to modulate them makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
In the spirit of truth-seeking, can you, Bret, clarify a statement that you have made several times? Black lives are undervalued. By whom, Bret, are they undervalued specifically?
By us collectively. And I hesitate to say I think that includes Black people. But there is a degree into which there is an almost an expectation of misfortune befalling Black people that has just been, I think, absorbed into the culture. And what it means is that, this has been pointed out in certain contexts, like the degree to which people freak out when a white woman has disappeared compared to a Black woman. I'm not sure if this has been quantified, but there is a tendency for society to empathize more in certain cases than others. And I think it really does have significant effects. A crisis is less of a crisis when it happens to a Black neighborhood. And, that's something we have to address. Now, I don't think you can address it by wagging your finger at people. That's not going to work. We can address it structurally. And, I find myself in a very different position than many of the people in our social circle with respect to things like, do we need, Black-focused hero narratives, right? I actually think we probably do. And I've gotten some pushback from Black people on this, right? That's a concession I shouldn't make, but I really believe it. It doesn't mean that you can't empathize with a character that doesn't look like you. I think you can, and I hope that we will all do that trick. I certainly empathize with female characters, and I empathize with Black characters. But to the extent that especially for younger kids, that there might be some tendency to more easily project yourself into the role of somebody who in some superficial way looks like you, I think it would be healthy. And the great thing would be that we get society to a place where those superficial characteristics matter so little that all of these narratives become available to all of us, right? And that the really important thing is, suffice it to say, it should be about the content of their character rather than the color of the skin of the protagonists.
I mean, I think you're demonstrably right that the younger the child, the more suggestible they are, and if they only see narratives of people being heroic who don't look like them, it might be a conclusion that at least some of those children could come to, that they therefore aren't made of the right stuff to become heroic. What we see 100% is this recognition being gamed, and I don't know that it is being gamed racially. I hope not. I don't even actually know what that would look like, although I'm sure we'll hear from people who can point me to some examples, but it's 100% being gamed by the trans rights activists. And the idea that you put in front of little children, the idea that they are maybe not the sex that their parents say they are, when in fact we know this to be an incredibly rare condition that is not created by reading a book or from wanting to cosplay as a kid or wanting to play around with gender norms, because that's in part what childhood and adolescence is about. This in part, this successful gaming of narrative and playing on the suggestibility of young children and the gullibility of parents is part of why we're in the bad position we're in right now with the rise of so-called trans people among teenagers.
I also wonder if marketing culture has exacerbated something terribly, in that basically because marketers profit by making people insecure about something that they then can be sold a solution to, that we have been sold archetypes that are far narrower than they might otherwise be. And in fact,
and it plays too on the insecurity of parents. I mean, if for people who aren't parents, you won't necessarily know this. Parents are expected to be uncomfortable and unsure about what they're doing in modern culture. And those of us who are like, well, no, we don't necessarily know what we're doing, but let's figure it out as we go along. And let's not look to authority for answers, but try to deduce from observing our children and ourselves and what works and what doesn't, how best to interact, and always do so with love. We found ourselves rare among parents who we interacted with in not feeling it necessary to look for authoritative sources on how it was that we were supposed to be doing what we were doing. And given that, and given that the market is everywhere and it is bullying people into suggesting that they have no idea what they're doing and they really need to do something different and they need to buy this in order to fix the problem that they're causing, that I think actually it's not just the suggestibility of the little children, but the gullibility of the parents who are buying these products because they're being told by some number of forces, some of which are not good at all, that if they do not affirm their child's gender identity, for instance, right this very moment, that they are being bad parents, well, that's gaming of parents, not just destroying children. And obviously the destruction of children is far more important. But hey, parents, try not to be gamed. If there's some chance that this is going to cost you some money to be gamed, there's a good chance that that's what's going on, being gamed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and many people are trying to sell you one wrong idea or another for various different reasons. In the case of marketers, it's the most obvious, but there are all kinds of bad ideologies with respect to parenting that have been floated. I was just going to add that when we have traveled, especially Latin America is the place where I've been most systematic about this, but I have frequently gone into the cosmetic section of supermarkets. And I don't know if I've discussed this before publicly, but the wall of, for example, hair care products, or baby products too, they represent an archetype of what people should look like. And it's definitely Latinized, but it is very light skin. It's
often a blonde white woman. Right?
Well, no, I see more. It's Latinas, but very, very light skin, leaning very much towards the North American aesthetic, which is itself being pushed by an advertising industry that obviously is using dissatisfaction to sell people stuff. But anyway, the difference, the supermarket's a great place because you're right there with the actual people. And you're right there with the image that they're being sold, and the two are not a match. And anyway, it's very striking once you tune into it, because at home we ignore what's on the shelf. We try to, because it's an attack on us.
Yep.
It's something that we learn to ignore, but tuning back in is very useful.
I mean, this will be totally not obvious to people who, to most people, that one of the things that we find value in travel is precisely spending time, like when we're not deep in nature, when we're actually in a town exploring, like sure, we explore the churches and the museums and and whatever it is that, and hang out in the squares and eat the local food and see if we can talk to local people, but also going into hardware stores and going into markets and just spending time in the space where the local people are buying the things that they need to do the stuff of their lives. From a hardware store, you can figure out what kinds of problems they're having to solve. And we started doing this when we were both doing graduate work in would have been Costa Rica and Panama. And so I would find myself going into a hardware store because I really needed a bunch of netting and cords and okay, how am I going to make this big enclosure that I have to make with what's here? And so it was driven by my desire to solve a problem, but you learned a tremendous amount about what problems were being solved by the local people as well. And because it's not a Home Depot or a Lowe's, probably, it is in the big cities down there at this point, but the local hardware store tells you something, just like the local feed store in a small US town will tell you something about the local economy and the local people and local culture in a way that the Lowe's at the city 30 miles up the road won't.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're in a very hot place where you can't escape the heat, you can also go into a supermarket and pretend to be buying cheese, which is something I'm not proud that we've done this.
We did that in Venice last year, actually. Yes.
It was hot.
It was really hot.
It was hot.
And sometimes you just have to actually open the cheese case in order to figure out if you want cheese.
That's a bridge too far. But pretending to buy cheese is it's well within your right as a North American.
I see. Okay. Imagine sometime within the next year you stumble across your ideal website for consuming general news. Are there any characteristics in its content or structure that come to mind that would make it stand out to you?
Yeah, I think you're getting such a large dose of this if you're a fan of this channel that this will not come as news. But actually, the way to do it is.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I feel like I have lots of answers and none of them are pithy enough.
Here's the thing. We were popular as professors. You were top level popular for various reasons, right? One of them had to do with the fact that we actually leveled with our students, which meant that there were several things that were unusual in other contexts that our students found with us. One was we told them things that were uncomfortable, and then we helped them sort through it. Also, when we were wrong, we told them we had been wrong. Mm-hmm. And so a news channel that pretends to be just simply accurate at a factual level and does not behave properly in the case that it is revealed to be otherwise is obviously a dangerous structure. So I would just say a newscast that was honest about what it didn't know, right? That was honest about the fact that there are biases that impact coverage no matter what you do, right? It's not like there is an objective way to report stories, but being honest about perspective and tracking, I think maybe the most important thing would be how well did the viewpoint and the report stand up to what followed, right? Was it borne out by what followed or not? So the predictive capacity of the approach is important.
Yeah. And for some reason, as you were talking, what came to mind was a class that had ended before we showed up. But when we started graduate school at the University of Michigan, we were told that there had been a long-standing course taught by, correct me if I'm wrong, Don Tinkle and Dick Alexander. I think Dick Alexander, who was your major PhD advisor, and he was on my committee, and Don Tinkle was dead by the time that we were there. And this, to people who aren't in sort of organismal biology space, this will seem like how different could they possibly be. But the two of them taught this course in which Dick was basically the evolutionist and Don was the ecologist. And they went at each other because very often evolutionary approaches to questions and ecological approaches to questions are dissimilar enough that they just, like ships passing in the night. They can't even see each other. They can't even see that they're addressing the same question in some cases. And so this class, which had run for many years at the graduate level at Michigan, was apparently incredibly powerful, also incredibly popular, but incredibly powerful precisely because it had two people who were both giants in their field, who like really were excellent scientists, and also had great personal respect for one another, and also really deeply disagreed with a lot of what the other person had to say. And so, I mean, and that was one of the things that we also did that was successful in the classroom, that we would disagree, and yet we, like, it was clear we were married and we appeared to be happily married. And so we were doing what we were doing, and we're perfectly willing, if one of us was up on the stage, the other one would raise their hands like, no, I think you got that wrong. And the students could see the disagreement in real time with no animus. Yeah. And this is what Don Tinkle and Dick Alexander did. And I know it's been tried in various ways in the news over the decades, sometimes successfully, some very often not. But I don't even know if anyone is attempting that at this point. So I would like, what do you say? An ideal website, like I would like some things that don't just have one person trying to take, go watch the Democratic convention, the Republican convention, and report back. But maybe even, fairly, polarized, entrenched people, but good faith, who actually can admit when they're wrong and who can see the wisdom of the other side going at it over ideas that they really disagree about.
Yeah, it has to be, the funny thing is the iconic example of this was Crossfire.
Right. And
I must say, Tucker Carlson, when he was on Crossfire, I found to be an incredibly troubling human being, right? In his later incarnation, I frequently find that this weird fact of him talking about things that are traditional left of center territory, like class warfare. He's very honest about class warfare, about the fact that it's bad for average Americans, that his class won. And he's frustrated that there's nobody on the other side properly articulating the counterpoint. So it's almost like what Crossfire didn't quite manage to be is something he has taken up doing later in life. And, I find
alone.
Yeah. It's an interesting, transition. But I do think we need a version of that. It has to not be driven by whatever Crossfire was driven by. And it can't be phony. But there's real room for something Lincoln Douglas debate style, where people with honest disagreements but respect for each other tangle. Yeah. And, this is what IDW was exploring.
Right. And maybe, not, you have sort of the extremes of like two hosts that are always the hosts and always will be. And, after a couple of years, probably, for many people, that dynamic may start to get stale, or you may start to get entrenched because that's what people are expecting now. Yeah. Or always guests, which don't necessarily, they're trying to just get their leg in, their foot in the door, and so they won't take as many risks as they should, et cetera. But, something like a rotating stable of 16, 20 people or something who come to understand each of those other 16 or 20 people and are, always rotated in, and will have, I'm sure you would end up with, I really like being on stage with those three guys and not those three, and here are the ones that I don't know as well. But that it would at least keep it a little bit more surprising and would, I think, avoid some of the problems of both of the extremes.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to see it happen.
Yeah. We're at close to 50 minutes. Oh boy, we've gotten through so few questions. There is only racism or lack of racism. There is no reverse racism or anti-racism. Racism can exist in degrees. It is not dichotomous. So I think I basically agree with that, although it is not dichotomous would appear to be contradicted by your initial statement. There's only racism or lack of racism. But I think
no.
I think I know what the point is here. That it's a continuum.
Yeah, it's a continuum, and it may not even have a discrete starting point, which is why you're hanging up on where is no. Where is it? There is only racism or lack of racism. So the lack of a discrete starting point is a challenge to that.
Yep.
We're going to have to define some level below which it's not racism.
Yeah.
But I'm going to push back slightly. I actually think racism naturally is a term that just simply stems from a race-first view of well-being. And so I agree to an extent. there is something different when a powerful group engages in a race-first view. It is different in some way than when a disempowered group engages in race-first thinking. So I think the problem is that is not a match for racism, right? That whatever racism plus the oppressed condition is some other term, and it is the co-opting of the term racism for this that is so very confusing. It doesn't mean that the addition of the two characteristics isn't some unique entity.
Okay, we're going to try to get through a number of the rest of these
All right.
fairly quickly. What is the evolutionary justification for allergies? Given how many grasses and molds I'm allergic to, it seems maladaptive.
Yeah, allergies are maladaptive.
That's right.
A lot of them seems to stem from so the immune system makes different kinds of antibodies. Antibodies are immunoglobulins, Ig, and there are different classes of them. And the IgE system seems to be triggered by allergens, but not useful against pathogens, which makes it perplexing. Why would you have an antibody system that is reacting to things that aren't actually hostile to you? Now, there is strong evidence that actually this system was adaptive against things like worms, and that the absence of worms in modern life has left it idle, and that it is somehow responding to molecules that it shouldn't be. And so you're absolutely correct. Allergies are in and of themselves maladaptive. Why we experience them has something to do with a mismatch between us and our modern environment, and that mismatch may be in whole or in part the absence of the pathogen to which those antibodies are targeted.
Okay, the next two are comments. It doesn't matter what the action or token is, which is shown by the fact that it's made up on the spot. It is a symbol of pure power, which states we're now in control and there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah, so this to our discussion in the last hour. I think that's right. And a second comment from someone else. Love and support you both, and Bret, I hope the Unity Project works out eventually. We will need it. But it's become clear to me that a firm hand is needed to deal with the baying of donkeys. Trump has my vote. We've heard this from other people.
Yep.
I think you should cool criticism of people wearing masks outside. Some people feel safer with them on, even if they realize the lack of utility and don't judge others. It can help psychologically. Yeah, I think this is right. I'm concerned that people are increasingly going to be so completely covered that they're not going to get any exposure to the sun at all. And this is just obviously one of the drums I'm banging lately. But I do agree. I mean, I think I would rather they not look with fear and hostility at those of us who will not wear masks outside when we understand, when what we believe to be true about the virus now means that keeps us safe and that we are in fact doing just fine without masks outside. But I hear this.
I feel slightly misunderstood. I have no criticism if you want to wear a mask outside and if you feel, you're taking an extra step. What I feel is, I want to alert people that, the fact is you could do everything in your power not to encounter any human beings. You could also wear a full body hazmat suit, right? There are all sorts of things you could do that you're not doing. So you are drawing a line somewhere. And my point to people is, winter is coming, as we keep saying. Now is the moment to take advantage of the fact that you have the daylight, you have UV radiation giving you double protection outside, and to the extent that you are going to feel oppressed when winter arrives back here in the Northern Hemisphere, this is a moment to drink in as much direct contact with the outside world as you can. So if somebody feels safer wearing the mask, that's fine. But I want them to know that they have a choice about where they're drawing the line, and that I firmly believe you have an obligation to wear your mask indoors to protect others, even if you don't believe it. Just the chances that you're wrong are so great, you have that obligation. But the data itself tells us outside, for the moment at least, is quite safe. And, if you're standing talking to somebody, maybe you should put your mask up. That's probably right. But if you're just walking along, the chances are minuscule, and you might as well take the advantage of good weather and reduce the level of oppression, because you're going to feel the opposite 6 months from now.
Yeah. This is another comment. Interesting. Starship Troopers is on the Army Officer Reading List. This is this Heinlein book. I actually read it for the first time sometime in the last couple of years. So he says, Starship Troopers is on the Army Officer Reading List. It gives the closest account to what it feels like in basic training. Interesting. Gives you insight into how soldiers are conditioned to not buckle under pressure.
Interesting. It has also been recommended to me by Dave, who made the knife behind me.
What should one do if they feel like they're in a group with some wolves in sheep's clothing and some sheep? I spared myself the struggle session and walked away. Does that make me a coward?
No, but I would certainly, if you can identify who the sheep are and who the wolves are, you might begin to create spaces that are safe enough that you can explore this with the sheep, so that they are at least aware enough that at the point...
Wolf-free spaces?
Wolf-free spaces, yes.
That's what you're advocating for?
WFSs, yes. Wolf-free spaces are very good for sheep. So anyway, you might explore it with them such that even if they can't hear you right away, at the point the wolves begin to reveal themselves, they will think back to what you said, and potentially it will trigger something.
That's it. Lodge something that can show back up in people's memory. Are you familiar with the Soviet defector Yuri Bezmenov? The current movement on the far left seems to be closely following a strategy somewhat similar to what he outlined for a Marxist takeover of society. Do you have thoughts?
Yep, I'm familiar a bit. I've done a little bit of listening. Somebody recommended, and I, on a drive somewhere, was listening to it.
Yep.
I get something from it. I'm a little concerned that I'm not exactly sure enough what is being said in order to... yes, this is now showing up in dialogue about this strategy, but I'd like to understand better what it is people are seeing. At the moment, I think the alignment between it and what we are seeing is too loose to actually have any useful sense about it.
Okay, two more here, and then we'll switch to this hour's super chat. Hydroxychloroquine and zinc combo is not dangerous. Observational studies show it lowers mortality and severity of COVID. Why not take it, since there are no downsides and there's a chance of upside? So this question reads to me quite different depending on whether or not, I imagine that some people would argue, why not just take it sort of prophylactically, like a multivitamin? And some people, and maybe that's what you mean here, and maybe what you mean is if you have COVID, why not take it?
I think that's the implication.
I think so too. Although I want to address the first possibility first, which is, again, the first possibility of what is being said here is why not just take this sort of hydroxychloroquine zinc combo prophylactically, since there are no downsides and there's a chance of upside. We don't know what downsides there are, and unless you actually understand yourself to have COVID-19, the fact that zinc you're probably going to have a hard time overdosing on zinc, but anything that you take in excess has a chance of affecting you badly. And hydroxychloroquine, yes, originally it's I can't remember what botanical chloroquine originally.
Quinine from.
It's quinine. It's the tree. I can't think what it is at the moment.
Yep, it'll come to me.
Or leaf. But it's synthesized in a lab with a whole bunch of other stuff. And, for instance, we know, and I'm not saying that is at all what's going on with hydroxychloroquine, but one of the big health effects of the opioid addiction in the U.S. is that there's a whole lot of other stuff that comes with the pills that people are getting the opiates from. And so the fact that Tylenol has been part of the opiates that people are becoming addicted to, and that Tylenol has known liver toxicity and causes hearing loss and all of these other things, means that some by no means all, and probably not the majority, but a large fraction of the downstream health effects of the opiate epidemic is because people are getting their opiates through pills that were produced with other things, in part as a measure to reduce people's reliance on opiates. So, it's a vicious circle that is causing problems because of the other things in the pills. So, I don't know what else is in the hydroxychloroquine or how it's synthesized, or even just what the effects of hydroxychloroquine long-term on a body are. But if you're talking about the other thing, which is if you have COVID-19, does this cocktail seem to be effective and low risk? It does, especially if you catch it early. It seems like the later you are in the progression of the disease, the less likely it is to do any good.
We talked previously about a situation in which I briefly thought I might have COVID, and it turned out I didn't. But at that time, I certainly was of the mindset, if I wanted to get hydroxychloroquine, could I? I think the answer is it's actually difficult in Oregon to do so. Mm-hmm. And that troubles me because I do think, as we've tried to articulate, COVID is less deadly in the acute sense than we thought, but it is more destructive than we thought. And so anything you can do to reduce the effectiveness of the disease once you have contracted it is probably worthwhile. It's probably even worth taking a significant risk. The brain damage and the heart damage that seem to be regular products of COVID-19 are serious. And so I hate that this is a political question. I hate that people will take my answer as political. But if I came down with COVID-19, I would be interested in sourcing hydroxychloroquine quickly because that's when it has maximal effect, and I think I would be very likely to take it.
Yeah. Okay. You were at 1 hour. Okay. I finally know why I like you guys, even though we don't totally agree politically. Your movie list is my movie list, including Fellini and Gilliam. Gilliam?
Yep.
Terry Gilliam. Okay. Let's answer several of the questions that came in this hour. To what extent would you say you two espouse objectivism a la Ayn Rand, favor individualism to collectivism, and feel these philosophies are missing from the American conversation?
I would say not at all in the Randian sense, but there is, we've tried to lay this out a little bit. I think the thing is, society should endeavor to deliver a fair structure in which people can take personal responsibility and it has the maximum possible effect. In other words, you want as much of this shunted over to personal responsibility landscape as you can, but a fair landscape in which people's personal responsibility functions best is desirable. And so I feel like the problem with the Ayn Randian view of the universe is it just focuses entirely on one side of a two-sided truth and is very unsatisfying in that regard. But that said, the world I want to see is one in which personal responsibility works.
Yeah. Is Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA no longer present in current humans? Why? Did sapiens moms, supported by sapiens culture, survive better than Neanderthal moms, and were Neanderthal moms never integrated into sapiens culture? Oh, wow. Interesting. I don't know the answer. I've never thought to ask the question before. And I know that I have not seen any papers that specifically mention Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA. The just super basic genetic molecular biology underlying the question is that mitochondrial DNA, because it is in the egg and not in the sperm, can be tracked entirely through the maternal line. And so we would expect to see Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA in any descendants of Neanderthal females. And if there are no Neanderthal females in our descendants, and of course we know that Europeans have a fair bit of, some Neanderthal in us, does that mean that it's entirely from the male line?
I don't think so. And I think this actually treads very close to a question from our last live stream that we ultimately chased down to bedrock, I thought.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, actually.
And so basically the idea is, you should you don't see it similarly?
No, actually, it's not going to be the same. So, well, and we should clarify. The question from last time was about the Y chromosome, and do all the male descendants of, say, Genghis Khan have his Y chromosome? No, unless it's an uninterrupted male line.
Right.
Because the daughter of Genghis Khan would have two X chromosomes, and her son would still be a male descendant of Genghis Khan, but would not have his Y chromosome. Whereas the son of Genghis Khan would have his Y chromosome because there was only one Y to be transferred. Compared to the egg is present. Well, maybe.
I think it may be the same.
Maybe it's the same.
Yeah.
So the son of a Neanderthal mother. No. Yeah, the son of a Neanderthal mother could have a daughter who would have a daughter who does not have Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA, even though he is Neanderthal. Well, the son of a Neanderthal mother who has a Homo sapiens father.
Yep.
Actually, that part doesn't matter. If he is having sex with a sapiens female, then their son would, or their daughter. Their daughter would have sapiens mitochondrial DNA. So that explains why we don't inherently. That doesn't inherently mean that there are no maternal ancestors in the Neanderthal line, but it is interesting, isn't it, that at least I have not heard any mention of mitochondrial DNA from the Neanderthal line.
No, I mean, I think this seems straightforward because a tiny selective advantage of sapiens mitochondria would be expected in the scenario that we just painted.
Why?
Because the point is that selective advantage, what you have is a decoupling of the genomic DNA from the mitochondrial DNA, and a slight advantage of sapiens mitochondria could account for the total absence of mitochondrial winners that would be handed.
Oh, it absolutely could. I just asked you why you expect a selective advantage.
I don't, but the fact that you don't find these other mitochondria
Okay, so
could...
all it takes, the only assumption it takes is a tiny selective advantage of sapiens mitochondrial DNA over Neanderthal. I was just asking you what you think that might be, but it actually isn't necessary
it's just proof of concept that something simple could result in this. I also think that just a simple law of large numbers issue could be sufficient in this case, that the question of an unbroken female line might be very unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I could imagine hybrid advantage to sapiens Neanderthal hybrids that would account for certain bits of genome being transmitted through time.
Yeah.
I can imagine a neutral comparison between the mitochondria of Neanderthals and sapiens, resulting in the loss of the Neanderthal DNA for no selective reason, just because it would have been small in percentage.
Yep.
And I could also imagine a small advantage of mitochondrial DNA from sapiens driving out the other. And so I guess the point is, I don't think this is all that surprising because there are multiple routes that you would get there.
Okay. Next question. We're going to do a few more and go over a little bit since we took a long time on the early questions. We have 21 plus senses, Ryan argues, but only test if the main 5 are calibrated properly. Could some people be sensing reality in dramatically different ways than others? What are the adaptive advantages and trade-offs? Well, I'd love to see the reference on 21 plus senses, but certainly we have more than the 5 that are usually talked about, including several different. Basically, touch needs to be disaggregated into several, into pressure, into temperature, into at least one more. I can't quite movement.
Pain.
And pain. Yeah. And there are senses that we don't seem to have, but other organisms do. And so is it possible that we have any latent, for instance, magnetoreception or electroreception or vomeronasal sense, what you see when when a horse or your cat seems to smell something on the wind, but opens their mouth a little bit. That's not actually smelling. It's a sort of it's a chemical sense like smell and taste, but it's taking in larger odorant molecules than smell can assess. And supposedly our vomeronasal organ is turned off. It's not hooked up, but it's a question. So there are definitely other senses that we have that are possible, and there are ways to disaggregate the senses that we do know we have in ways that might be more useful, even like vision, color vision versus black and white, lines versus pattern. These are all interesting and useful ways, I think, to actually talk about the senses.
One, Jacobson's organ, which is the vomeronasal organ in people.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it passes the adaptive test. If it was rapidly shrinking, that would be a different question. But if it is persistent in its size, then it passes the adaptive test. And that means that, like the appendix, we will likely discover that it is hooked up to something or is some other way useful.
Let's just let me just add a little bit in there. I actually don't remember the size of it or maybe I never knew, in all the other primates. But one thing we see with the origin of primates, mammals, our mammal history has a strong move towards smell as one of the dominant senses that is going on in mammals. And we see the primitively smell part of the brain becomes actually the cerebral cortex in us. And so that's the part that gets really big. And so you have, well over 100 million years, maybe well over 200 million years of basically smell forward evolution in mammals. And then you get to the origin of primates, and smell begins to take a backseat to vision. And you see basically the visual cortex is getting bigger. You have eyes moving from more on the side of the head to more binocular, so that you can end up getting depth of field, and they're bigger relative to the face. So primates in general are becoming more vision focused, but it has been a sort of a pat answer, of course, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but it has been a pat answer that, primates just don't smell well. And of course we are a primate, and we smell even less well than everyone else because we are so vision driven, and that's not actually how it works, right?
You're saying that wrong. Primates don't smell good. And this is a misapprehension that
especially
comes from
baboons.
Zoos. Yes. Well, you are about to tell me something that I don't know, I hope.
Okay.
How far back is the vomeronasal organ supposedly unhooked?
Oh, so I don't know. Right. So are there, I'm trying to think as I'm just filling space with words here. Are there any primates? That was the dog, not me thinking. Are there any primate species that are understood to have active and functioning vomeronasal organs? I can't think of any.
So what that says then is that this is a slam dunk.
It's
the
adaptive.
Vomeronasal organ remains adaptive, or at least has until very recently in our line, because we're talking about many millions of years of it persisting with no value, which makes no sense, of course. So take that as a challenge. Here's the other thing. What happened? You were talking about vomeronasal organs. This was the perfect opportunity for you to invoke lizards, which you have been talking about doing, and you just blew right by it.
I'm done. I'm done with lizards.
What happened?
I'm done.
Okay, well, final thing. 21 senses. I'm not sure what that refers to. I'd love to know. I know that there are 16 different kinds of awesome, and I can imagine that there would be a sense for each of them. 21, though, seems a stretch, but I'd love to know.
Yeah, maybe there's 16 kinds of awesome plus the 16 other kinds of senses plus the main 5 senses that he's named here. So 16 plus 5. There you go.
You've got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 senses working overtime. And with that, we'll move on to the next question.
I think we will. In one of this is from Bill Maher, apparently.
Wow.
In one of Jordan Peterson's lectures, he lists off careers and the IQ needed to succeed in those fields. I find this discouraging. Can a person with an average IQ succeed in complex fields? Can hard work compensate for being average? Thank you. I'd like to see that lecture. I'll bet he does a more nuanced. I bet he has a more nuanced take than that suggests.
Yep. People take IQ to mean heritable, and they take heritable to mean hardwired by the genome, and it doesn't mean these things. Here's the thing. Expose your kids to stuff that enhances their ability to calculate, right? I don't mean calculate in the narrow mathematical sense, though. That stuff is quite good. But the basic point is IQ is amenable to intervention as much as the literature casts doubt on that in some context. But I just don't think this means what we think it means. Are there ways to compensate? Yes. The earlier the intervention, the more likely it is to succeed. And the question really is, can you find puzzles that exercise the relevant circuitry in a useful and self-augmenting way?
Okay, good. If conscience is an adaptation, does that mean that our life choices that go against our evolved nature, even detrimentally, are as well? For instance, modern diets and excessive internet use.
I don't get this question yet. Do you?
Not quite. I think basically, if you have, I think the question is, if the ability to make choice is an adaptation, does that mean that every choice that you make is therefore adaptive? And no. The answer is no.
Well, I think this surfaces a really important thing, though, which is that you can have two adaptations in opposition. This is the same thing.
Oh, this is also true. Yeah.
Talking about with foreskin and circumcision.
Yeah.
Right. Foreskin is a morphological adaptation. Circumcision is a cultural adaptation. Presumably, they are responsive to different environments in which different top values are reflected. So, what the person is getting at is basically, and you should frequently expect this to be the hierarchy, that a cultural mechanism will interrupt a deeper adaptive mechanism, right? So forbidding yourself access to something for some reason is two things in opposition. And I think if I'm reading the question,
there it is.
Modern life choices that go against our evolved nature as well. Yes, totally. If you are prone to seek sugar because sugar was so scarce in your ancestral environment that you were in no danger of toxifying yourself with it, and any amount you could get was a win, and now you're forbidding yourself sugar because you're making yourself sick or fat with it, that is your ability to detect a pattern, which is adaptive, overriding, and more basic pattern, which is...
But the meta level might be adaptive, but that doesn't mean that all the choices are.
No. There's not going to be... Is all in there?
Does that mean that our life choices that go against our evolved nature are as well?
Okay. Then the ambiguity is in the question. The problem is, if you say all, then the answer is no. If you say some, then the answer is many are, but not all.
The woke YouTube channel was useful last night in Wisconsin. It's multiple live cams of all protests, in quotes. By 1 a.m., it looked like a scene from Terminator with all the burning cars and buildings. If that's a protest, I never want to see a riot. Yeah, I don't know this channel, but that's a useful
I saw many of the
connection.
videos, though.
Yeah.
There is no way we are going to get out of this if we don't find some way to arrest that impulse.
Yeah. Let's do 3 more. The last of which is a comment. I have recently encountered a flat earther at my workplace who is actively trying to convert and brainwash younger, more impressionable staff members. I find it hard to address this individual without losing my temper. Do you have advice? I assume here that flat earther is metaphorical, although we know that there are actually some flat earthers out there. I mean,
No, I think this is literal.
Well, I think it's more important in the moment to answer this as if it's metaphorical, but you want to do it literal?
Well, if it's literal,
yeah,
then time zones are the key to tormenting this person into seeing the light. If it's metaphorical, it's more difficult.
Yeah.
So what is it? What do you think we're being asked?
we're being asked about the creeping ideology that is taking over about the. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't have exactly put it in flat earther terms, but it's everything we've been talking about. It's these people who have adopted the woke thinking. I may be wrong.
In which case, we've talked about this, it's a problem because it's the game theory and the fear of being stigmatized that drives people. And so, it's going to be very hard to create enough safety that people can actually see it. I guess maybe I would ask, if this is really about that woke ideology, I would ask to hear what system it is that they envision and how is it going to function, because it doesn't seem to answer any of those questions.
Actually, it might, if this really is a flat earther, like I've never met one in real life, as far as I know. It strikes me as sort of unicornish. It might be, I mean, it's your workplace, and so you have to be careful, but it might be really useful to try to develop tools that could also be deployed against the kind of woke mob. But because in the case of flat Earth, you're simply right and he's simply wrong, and there's just no end of evidence in support of your position and no end of evidence against his, I presume. I may be wrong, maybe it's a her. So it seems like you could consider all of the evidence and try in a number of different ways to engage your coworkers. See if you put a good piece of evidence in the heads of a couple of your coworkers, if it comes back to you through someone else's mouth. It seems like an interesting way to see how such thinking can spread and how you might arrest it in what is, in one way, as high stakes as it gets, because someone who actually believes that the earth is flat can presumably not be reasoned with on any number of subjects. But in another way, the stakes are incredibly low, because what actually does a totally ludicrous belief in a flat earth, how will that manifest in such a way that anyone is less safe as a result of sharing a refrigerator with them?
All right.
Okay. Do you have thoughts about the unfortunate connotations of light as good and dark as evil? See, for instance, Biden's DNC speech, as misapplied to skin color. What other simplistic associations have we not shaken off evolutionarily?
Yeah. My thought is we all need to just grow up, and that you can go around policing these little things, but I don't see that as it's not significant, right? It's significant if you imbue it with power.
Yeah.
Even if it has a racist history, if we all just understand that this is, it's like gender in romance languages. The fact that the table is female is really not troubling, right? You could take it as troubling, but it just isn't.
And see my earlier comment about the origin of primates, which is probably more than 100 million years ago, saw our ancestors moving towards a vision forward life, and that meant becoming less nocturnal and more diurnal and relying on photons and being able to see things literally. And of course, our English, like every language, is filled with metaphor, and most of the metaphors are actually hiding. Like almost every sentence that we use, even ones that we think are very, very straightforward, are filled with metaphor. And so, of course, we have come to associate light with goodness and dark with places where things can hide, because literally things can hide when you cannot see them. The unfortunate coincidence that the group of people who have most frequently suffered racism have darker skin than those who have most frequently been the ones enforcing that racism is actually just a coincidence. It's just not related in any way. Like there's just nothing there that makes that a correlation. And so we have all these metaphors in the English language as a result of us being diurnal and vision focused. And then we also have melanin as an adaptation to living near the equator, and add to that a sort of a guns, germs, and steel style argument around which peoples were most likely to be taken advantage of. And it's just not the same thing. And so, you can map those on. And it's really unfortunate because there's no mapping that should be happening there. What other simplistic associations have we not shaken off? I'm sure there's many, many, and we should come back to that question. But at the moment, I'm not thinking of them.
Yep.
And finally, just a comment. Grateful for your podcast. You model so much: decency, patriotism, a great personal and professional relationship, and intellectual fun. Thank you, Diana.
All right.
Thank you. All right.
Well-
So that's it for episode 41. I believe we will be back on Saturday. We keep on saying this. We really are going to drop to somewhat less frequent. In fact, we won't be back a week from now, I think. But we'll be back on Saturday for episode 42. And immediately following that will be, the next day, will be our private Q&A that's available to people who subscribe to my Patreon. And you can look at either of our Patreons, go to either of our Patreons, and become patrons to access the private Discord server. And
Unity will be having a campfire tomorrow, Wednesday. I've forgotten whether we moved the time, so I'm not going to say a time. Check out our channel, and you will find out that 4 p.m. Pacific time, a voice said to me. 4 p.m. Pacific time. So anyway, that should be great. Tune into that. And we've released the Brendan O'Neill episode of Dark Horse. That is now available on the channel. You can go check that out. And we will see you next time. In the meantime, be well.